Close your eyes and imagine walking into a massive stone building tucked between crumbling temples and noisy markets. It's early afternoon and the sun is baking the clay rooftop side, but in here, everything feels thick with heat. Not just from the sunlight streaming through narrow windows, but from steam. Moisture clings to the marble columns like a second skin. You hear the echo of voices, dozens of them, men laughing, arguing, chatting about politics and grain prices, all while lounging on benches, soaking in pools, or getting their backs scraped with curved metal tools. The air smells like warm olive oil, smoke, and something else. Something human and earthy and not exactly clean. You've just entered an ancient public bathhouse, and whether you like it or not, your sandals are already wet with whatever is pooling on the floor. Public baths were a cornerstone of daily life in many ancient civilizations, especially Rome and Greece. They weren't considered optional luxuries, but rather fundamental parts of urban life. To modern sensibilities, that might be hard to grasp after all. Who would want to share a tub with 50 sweaty strangers? But to the ancients, bathing was a social experience, a civic duty, and a cultural ritual all in one. It was where business deals were whispered, political alliances formed, friendships deepened, and yes, where bodies were cleaned. But we have to use that word cleaned with big quotation marks. Because ancient bathing wasn't about sterilization or killing germs. In fact, nobody even knew what germs were. What mattered most was warmth, relaxation, and scraping off the visible layer of grime. Anything microscopic, well, that didn't exist as far as they were concerned. The Roman bathhouse. Or thermi was more than just a place to dunk yourself in hot water. It was a sprawling complex, often taking up several city blocks. Inside, you'd find cold rooms, frigidarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, hot rooms, caldarium, and often steam rooms too. There were also exercise areas called palaestrae, open-air courtyards, snack bars, massage stations, barbers, even small libraries. It was like a gym, spa, barber shop, and community center mashed together, and it cost almost nothing to enter. The government heavily subsidized access, meaning almost anyone rich or poor could afford to spend time there. But what was affordable for the people often came at a price. For their skin. If you were lucky enough to be bathing in an elite household, maybe in a private villa with your own little tub, things would be relatively quiet, maybe even tranquil. But in a public bathhouse, tranquility wasn't part of the deal. These were loud, sweaty, echoing places, constantly buzzing with activity. The floors were usually wet and slick with not only water, but also oil, dirt, and other bodily substances you really wouldn't want to step in barefoot. And yet barefoot you would be. It was standard practice to leave your shoes in the dressing area, which meant whatever was on that floor was now on your feet. And if you had a cut, or an ingrown toenail, or even a hangnail, well, welcome to an ancient version of Russian roulette. For all its cultural significance, the public bathhouse was a perfect storm of hygiene disasters. But because no one knew about bacteria or viruses, no one really saw the danger. Steam felt good. Warm water opened the pores. Scraping off the day's sweat and dust with a strigil, a curved metal blade, felt refreshing. And chatting with friends, while doing it all, that was just part of the experience. In fact, to not attend the baths regularly would mark you as rude, odd, or even antisocial. Everyone was expected to participate. The emperor bathed. The soldiers bathed. Children, merchants, laborers, even the slaves, everyone was in those. Baths, all mixing in the same communal spaces, breathing the same misty air, soaking in the same slightly murky pools. It was both an equalizer and a trap. Imagine entering a room so steamy that the walls sweat. There might be 10, 20, maybe 30 men reclining on benches or perched on the edge of a stone tub. The air is so hot it feels like breathing soup. A boy walks by with a tray of salted dates, selling snacks to anyone who can reach for one without fainting. In the corner, someone is getting a back massage with warmed oil, while next to him, someone else is vomiting discreetly into a bucket. From the heat, it's all very normal, all very human, all very unsterile, and let's not forget the bathwater itself. heated by massive furnaces below the floor. The water circulated, sort of. In most public baths, the pools weren't drained daily, sometimes not even weekly. The same water just got reused, warmed up again, maybe filtered through a bit of sand or charcoal, but rarely replaced entirely. That means every person who soaked, scraped, or splashed left a little bit of themselves behind: sweat, hair, oils, maybe blood, maybe worse. Over time, these communal baths became living organisms, thick with organic material, slowly marinating the citizens of Rome or Athens in their own collective residue. Yet no one seemed to mind. That's just how it was. The warmth soothed your muscles, and the company kept you entertained. The bathhouse wasn't just about individual bodies. It was about the body of society. People used the baths to conduct business, bribe officials, gossip, flirt, make enemies, make alliances. You could rise in status or fall from grace, all between the frigidarium and the caldarium. It was where emperors showed off their generosity, building vast complexes for public use. It was also where thieves prowled for easy pickings, and where the sick and healthy alike rubbed shoulders, literally. And through it all, the illusion of cleanliness persisted. The steam masked the smells, the oil masked the sweat, the marble masked the grime. It was a beautiful, gleaming, bacteria-ridden performance of purification. But the reality underneath was less glamorous. Because if you scratched too hard with your strigil or brushed up against someone's unhealed rash, you could walk out of the bathhouse with more than just a relaxed smile. You could leave with lice, with ringworm, with a case of something mysterious that made your skin peel for weeks, and yet they came back the next day, and the next dot, so welcome to the ancient bathhouse, equal parts relaxation and infection, elegance, health, friendship, and fungus. It may have looked like paradise carved in stone, but its real legacy lies not just in the marble columns or the artful mosaics, but in the microbial soup you were soaking in all along. Before we dive further into the oils, sweat, and mystery liquids of the ancient world, it's important to understand what clean meant to people back then. Because in ancient times, especially in cultures like Rome and Greece, cleanliness was not about eliminating invisible pathogens or bacteria. The concept of germs, tiny, unseen creatures that live on your hands or in your water, didn't exist. Microscopes wouldn't be invented for over 1,000 years. Soap as we know it wasn't widely used. What mattered was appearance, ritual, and, strangely enough, your moral character dot in the ancient mindset. Being clean had far more to do with virtue, class, and discipline than it did with hygiene in the modern sense. Cleanliness was a visible and symbolic act. A man who bathed regularly and kept his skin smooth and his hair styled was thought to have his life in order. He was refined, cultured, worthy of respect. But if a man looked disheveled, unwashed, or smelled too strongly of labor and sweat, it wasn't just offensive, it was suspicious. People might assume he was lazy, poor, or immoral. Dirt, in many ways, was seen as a symptom of moral decay. This mindset didn't just emerge from nowhere. It was baked into ancient religion and philosophy. In Greek culture, the gods themselves were imagined as eternally youthful, beautiful, and glowing with vitality. Being clean, perfumed, and orderly was a way of emulating that divine state. In Roman society, where everything was about status and optics, presenting yourself well meant signaling to the world that you belonged in civilized company. Your outward appearance was your raison, your character reference, and your social rank, all rolled into one. In some public spaces, particularly the bathhouses, your level of grooming was on full display. So even if you were steeped in oil and surrounded by floating debris, at least you looked polished. This obsession with surface level cleanliness also led to some peculiar practices. For example, in the Roman world, people would rub scented oils onto their skin, not because the oils cleaned anything, but because they made you smell better. Then, using a tool called a strigil, a curved blade made of metal or bone, They would scrape the oil back off, along with any dirt or sweat stuck to it. In theory, this removed the outer layer of filth, but in practice, it mostly just smeared everything around and left you feeling moisturized in a very greasy, slightly questionable way. Still, it looked like cleanliness. It felt like refreshment. That was good enough. What's especially fascinating and a little alarming is how deeply this idea of clean equals good was tied to morality. In some ancient texts, people described evildoers as physically filthy, stinking, or covered in grime. It wasn't just metaphor. It was believed that wickedness made the soul and the body dirty. A criminal might be described as unclean, not because he skipped a bath, but because his actions corrupted his essence. Similarly, slaves and lower class workers, who often labored in dirt and heat, were sometimes viewed as less virtuous simply because they couldn't maintain the same polished appearance as the wealthy. Dirt was unfairly equated with vice. Religious rituals doubled down on this philosophy. In ancient Rome, before participating in certain sacrifices or temple rites, you were expected to undergo ritual washing. In Judaism, similar ideas appear, in the form of mikveh bathing. And in many Eastern cultures, purification involved both literal and symbolic cleansing. It wasn't about removing germs, it was about becoming spiritually fit. If you were sick, mourning, menstruating, or had committed some offense, you were unclean. This wasn't just a bodily condition, it was a spiritual and social state. Water was a reset button, washing away not just dirt, but guilt, shame, or impurity, but water didn't need to be clean itself. That's the strangest part to modern ears. Because while ancient people placed a high value on the act of bathing, they didn't apply the same scrutiny to the water they were bathing in. Public bathhouses reused water constantly. Pools weren't drained regularly, and if they were, it was more about removing visible gunk than disinfecting anything. In some cases, people even bathed downstream from where others had dumped waste or done laundry. A bath was a symbolic gesture, not a surgical procedure. You stepped into that pool not because it was sterile, but because it was warm, soothing, and socially accepted. Soap was also surprisingly scarce. The Greeks used clay, ashes, and even sand to scrub the body. Romans eventually adopted rudimentary soaps made from animal fats and lye. But these were harsh and rarely used in the bathhouse. Instead, the oily scraping method ruled supreme. Imagine standing in a steaming room rubbing olive oil on your arms while an attendant stands nearby with a communal scraping tool. That strigil may have been used on 5 other people before you, and it wasn't wiped out in between uses. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that the act itself signaled discipline and cleanliness, even if you left with someone else's sweat embedded. In your pores, hair removal also became part of the cleanliness ritual. Men would pluck or shave their body hair to appear more refined. In some cases, this was even seen as a mark of civilization compared to the barbaric peoples who let hair grow freely. But again, it wasn't about hygiene. It was about aesthetics. You could be covered in invisible lice, and as long as your chest was smooth and your beard was neatly trimmed, you were considered well kept. Interestingly, some philosophers pushed back against all this. Thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus warned against becoming obsessed with luxury, perfumes, and elaborate grooming. They saw this as vanity, a sign of moral weakness. To them, true cleanliness was inner peace and ethical living, not how shiny your skin looked after a steam bath. But even they didn't fully reject bathing, they just recommended moderation. After all, no one wanted to be too dirty. You'd still have to walk among polite society. Perhaps the biggest irony of all is that these ancient systems of cleanliness, though deeply flawed from a modern medical perspective, did bring people together. The bathhouse wasn't just where you got rid of visible dirt. It was where you participated in the moral and civic life of the community. You scrubbed yourself next to your neighbor. You exchanged pleasantries, debated politics, or quietly judged someone's hairy back. Cleanliness was public. It was theatrical. It was a ritual of belonging, but Under all that philosophy and status signaling, the truth still lurked like mold in the steam room tiles. They didn't understand contagion. They didn't know about microscopic filth. And so every day, dozens or hundreds of people would bathe in the same warm, oil-slicked, people-infused water feeling righteous, looking polished, and blissfully unaware that what they called clean was a very human illusion. It starts with a single decision to undress, not just a little completely, every layer, every stitch. In ancient bathhouses, whether you were a senator, a soldier, or someone who swept the forum for a living, you were expected to leave your clothes and your modesty at the door. Today, nudity in public feels like a social emergency. But back then, in the marbled halls of Roman and Greek bathhouses, it was just part of the routine. Stripping down in front of strangers wasn't shocking. It was ordinary, expected. Even polite. Imagine walking into a wide, steamy chamber. Around you, dozens of men naked stretching, chatting, soaking in baths, or getting oiled down by attendants. No one flinches. No one hides. There's no locker room shuffle, no towel dance, no awkward glances. Your body was your body, and everyone could see it. The concept of privacy, especially bodily privacy, didn't exist in quite the same way. In fact, the bathhouse was one of the most public stages your body could appear on, and everyone participated. But communal nudity wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was cultural, even political. In the ancient world, especially in Greece, the human form was celebrated. Sculptures, paintings, and pottery all showed idealized bodies, naked athletes, warriors, gods. Physical beauty was associated with virtue, discipline, and divine favor. So, when men gathered in the gymnasia or bathhouses, stripping down was a kind of statement. It was honest, transparent. You were laying yourself bare, literally and symbolically, of course. This honesty came with expectations. Your body, after all, said something about who you were. Muscles showed strength and masculinity. Scars might suggest bravery or perhaps low status. Flab could be a sign of wealth or indulgence. Excessive hair, bad posture, or poor grooming, that said something too. And so, while nudity was normalized, it was also scrutinized. There were no clothes to hide behind. You were your skin, your walk, your scent, your scars. For younger men, especially, this could be a social trial. Teenagers and young adults entered. The bathhouse fully aware that their bodies were being compared, judged, noticed. In some cases, they were admired. In others, targeted. Because communal nudity also opened the door to attention that wasn't always welcome. Older men might leer. Relationships formed in esteem. Not all of them innocent. Bathhouses, while public, still had corners, curtains, and quiet places. And the blurred line between camaraderie and exploitation often depended on power and silence. That said, many bathers genuinely appreciated the freedom. Without clothes, everyone was more or less equal, or at least seemed to be. A wealthy landowner might sit beside a humble merchant. A centurion could soak beside a farmer. Class. Differences still mattered, but in the nude, everyone was reduced to skin and bones, hair and sweat. It was, paradoxically, a moment of social leveling, even if it only lasted for an hour. Interestingly, women's experience of public bathing was more complicated and much more restricted. In Roman times, some bathhouses had specific hours or days for female patrons. Others had separate wings. A few mixed-gender baths did exist, especially in the empire's more relaxed periods, but they were often criticized by moralists and conservative writers. Communal nudity was fine for men. For women, it was always walking a tightrope between leisure and scandal. Even in designated women's baths, social pressures remained intense. A woman's appearance could be judged harshly, and if she was seen entering a bathhouse too often or staying too long, whispers followed. Still, the female bathhouse had its own rhythm. Women bathed together, oiled each other, gossiped, laughed, and occasionally conducted business. But the threat of moral judgment never fully left the room. In literature, women in bathhouses were sometimes portrayed as indulgent or licentious, especially by male authors. Their nudity was exoticized, even feared, and so, while men enjoyed relative freedom, women's nudity in public was always political. Always loaded dot back in the male section. However, there was almost no shame. If anything, shame came from trying to cover yourself. Wearing a cloth around your waist might suggest you had something to hide or that you were timid, foreign, or prudish. Roman masculinity emphasized confidence, stoicism, and physical openness. Being bashful about your body was suspicious. What were you hiding? An illness? A deformity? A weakness of character? This boldness extended even to the bathhouse rituals. Getting oiled, for example, wasn't something you did alone. An attendant would rub the olive oil onto your skin, sometimes lingering over limbs or backs. Then came the scraping, often by someone else. In other words, another person touched you, handled your body, worked your skin. Nudity wasn't just visual, it was tactile. Physical boundaries were looser. What might seem invasive now was routine then. A man's body was a public object, a kind of shared civic artifact. Yet all of this openness didn't erase human awkwardness. Not everyone felt confident. Not everybody met the ideal. And though society tried to normalize communal nudity, there were always moments of discomfort. Teenagers with acne, veterans. With war wounds, men aging out of their prime. These bathers weren't immune to insecurity. They just had to pretend they were. Because to show embarrassment was worse than any physical flaw. It betrayed weakness, and weakness had no place. In the polished marble world of the Roman thermidor, and while the body was on display, it was rarely sexualized, at least not openly. The baths were social before they were sensual. You went there to bathe, to talk, to relax. Flirting happened, yes. Propositions too, but there were unspoken rules. Too much staring, too much lingering, and someone might call you out. Still, these boundaries were porous. Some bathhouses had reputations, especially in urban centers. Some were known for certain patrons or hidden alcoves, but in most cases, nudity was just ... normal. Background noise. Like the sound of splashing water, or the hiss of steam ... today. The idea of stripping down in front of your neighbors feels foreign, maybe even absurd. But in the ancient bathhouse, it was the first step in becoming part of the social body. You didn't just clean yourself, you exposed yourself. You became visible. You took your place among the steaming, glistening, oiled masses of Rome or Athens, and for a brief moment, your body wasn't just yours. It was part of the ancient ritual of belonging. And while it may seem disgusting now sitting, skin to skin with strangers in tepid water that hadn't been changed in days, it was, in their eyes, a sign of civilization, of culture, of confidence. Because to be clean in the ancient world was to be seen. And there was no hiding in the bathhouse. You stripped off your clothes, handed them to an attendant, and walked barefoot across the smooth, slightly slimy tiles. The air is warm, almost humid. It clings to your skin like an invisible veil. You follow the murmured voices and echoes of dripping water until you arrive at the edge of the pool. It's long, rectangular, surrounded by flickering torchlight. Steam rises gently from the surface. The water glistens, a sort of opaque shimmer that might, in a different context, seem peaceful. But as you step in and feel the lukewarm water swirl around your legs, you notice it's not quite clear. It's textured! Something brushes your calf. Was that a strand of someone's hair? Probably. There's no telling. This is the bathwater. The same bathwater used by dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies today. And it hasn't been changed to the ancient Romans. The water in a public bathhouse was less a pristine cleansing agent and more of a communal soup, a shared experience. And they didn't see anything particularly wrong with that. If it was warm, if it smelled mostly okay, and if it wasn't visibly horrifying, then it was still good to soak in. Modern concepts of sterilization or filtration were completely foreign. You didn't disinfect. You didn't test for pH levels or bacterial content. You just got in. The bath wasn't a sterile basin, it was a social stew, the caldarium. The hottest room in the bathhouse often had pools so hot that the steam alone could feel like breathing through cloth. These pools were supposed to open the pores and sweat out impurities, but all that sweat had to go somewhere. And that somewhere was directly into the water. In fact, the more people that used the bath throughout the day, the murkier it became. Not visibly filthy, not always, but unmistakably used. People oiled their bodies before entering, so the water had a glossy sheen, a kind of rainbow film floating on top that shimmered in the torchlight. It was beautiful in a way if you didn't think too hard about what it was now add in the skin. Tiny flecks from every body. Vestigial scrapings. Dead cells. Loose hairs. Everything that people rubbed, scrubbed, or scraped off themselves eventually ended up drifting lazily across the surface or sinking to the bottom. Some attendants tried to skim it away, but most of it simply dissolved into the water over time. Like broth gaining richness from too many ingredients. In colder pools, the frigidarium, the water was less steamy, but still reused. And because it wasn't heated, it was rarely refreshed as often. In fact, some frigidaria were fed by aqueducts. That simply let water cycle in slowly and drain just as slowly, making it less of a full refresh and more of a gentle dilution. Whatever went in stayed a while. One of the more infamous features of Roman baths was how the water would turn cloudy. This wasn't the result of minerals or intentional additives. It came from sheer human saturation, so many bodies soaking, and shedding that the clarity of the pool gave way to a pale, almost milky hue. Again, no one saw this as dangerous. If anything, it was a sign that the bath was popular. It had been used. And usage meant community. It meant value down, of course. Some pools were worse than others. The small, deep ones, used for short soaks, might be a little fresher. But the larger communal pools, especially in urban bathhouses, were often packed throughout the day. People came and went continuously, which meant the water was always in motion, but never quite renewed. Sometimes a bit of ash or herbs was tossed in, more to mask the smell than to clean anything. Olive oil, after all, has a strong scent when it's warm, and when it's been warmed by people's bodies, it begins to smell ... human. Not bad exactly, but unmistakable, and let's not forget what else could end up in the water. Cuts. Open. Sores. Blood from minor injuries. Rashes. Mysterious bumps and bites. There were no bandages, no waterproof coverings, no antiseptics. If you had something on your skin, it was in the water with you. And if someone else had something contagious, you were now sharing it. This was especially true for skin conditions. Ancient dermatology was largely observational. If something itched or oozed, you might rub oil on it. But bathing in hot water with dozens of others, that was fine. Nobody questioned it. Illness didn't always carry stigma. In fact, some people believed that the hot water itself had healing properties. People bathed because they were sick, and that meant their sickness was part of the water's composition down in the corners of the pool. Near the drain or the base of the walls, a kind of sludge often formed. A mixture of oils, body dirt, and whatever else hadn't been skimmed. It collected silently, a residue of routine. Modern archaeologists have found traces of this ancient bath sludge in excavated ruins. A blend of human materials, oils, ash, sand, and plant matter. It tells a story not of purity, but of persistence. The human body shedding, soaking, and existing in the same space over and over again. Maintenance varied by location. In large imperial bathhouses, slaves or attendants might occasionally drain and scrub the pools. But this was labor-intensive, and it didn't happen daily. More likely, the water was topped off, stirred around, and left to settle. If it got too bad, it might be dumped. But the standard approach was to keep it just clean enough to not cause complaints. and complaints were rare. People were used to it. They had no expectation of sparkling water or sanitized tiles. As long as you didn't step on something sharp, you were fine still. There must have been moments, quiet moments, when a bather glanced down at the oily surface of the water and wondered what exactly they were sitting in. Maybe a strand of hair drifted past. Maybe they felt a gritty substance under their thigh. But by then, the bath had already worked its magic. Muscles relaxed, breathing slowed, conversation picked up, and whatever was floating in the water was just part of the experience. Part of the human collective. That's the part that's hardest to imagine now. We think of bathing as a solo act, a private escape. But in ancient times, bathing was about merging your body into a shared space, a shared solution. You didn't cleanse yourself apart from the world. You soaked in the world and let it soak into you. The water wasn't clean, not by any modern measure. It was communal, lived in, full of stories, skin, and secrets. So next time you draw yourself a warm bath in silence, with clean, fresh water and soft towels nearby, remember that for the ancients, it was never just water. It was a broth of bodies, an echo of others, a soup of civilization. Disgusting, perhaps, but also deeply human. Picture yourself standing in the tepidarium now, the warm room of the bathhouse. Your skin is moist, your pores open, and the heat settles around your shoulders like a soft, heavy towel. You've just stepped out of the caldarium, the hottest room, where steam clouds everything and voices drift like ghosts. The next step in your bathing ritual isn't a cold plunge or a relaxing massage. No, it's time to be scraped. In the ancient Roman bathhouse, soap wasn't the norm. Most people didn't lather up. Instead, they used oil, usually olive oil, sometimes mixed with perfumes or crushed herbs, and rubbed it all over their bodies. Thick, sticky, slick. It wasn't necessarily about feeling clean. It was about appearing polished, smelling pleasant, and loosening the day's accumulated grime. Dirt, sweat, and dead skin would cling to the oil, creating a kind of human marinade. And once you were sufficiently oiled, the real work began. Enter the strigil, a curved metal scraper, about the length of a forearm, shaped like a sickle with a flattened edge. It was often made of bronze or iron and sometimes decorated with ornate handles. The strigil was the centerpiece of this strange, exfoliating dance. You'd grip it firmly and drag it across your skin, scraping away the oil and with it everything that had stuck to it. The sensation was sharp but not painful, rhythmic but not exactly soothing. It made a faint, squelching sound. You could feel the resistance as it dragged across your chest, your back, your legs. With each scrape, a layer of oil dirt sludge would collect on the edge of a glistening ribbon of your day's efforts, and probably someone else's dot now. Here's where the experience turns from curious to questionable. Because many bathers didn't scrape themselves. Instead, they had attendants, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers, sometimes slaves. And the same strigil might be used on several people in succession without being cleaned between uses. That means you might be feeling the cold metal edge that just scraped down the back of a man who had a rash or an insect bite or something more mysterious. Maybe he had nicked himself. Maybe his skin was oozing slightly from sunburn. It didn't matter. The tool moved from body to body like a baton in a relay race of exfoliation. And what happened to all that oily gunk scraped off? Sometimes it was wiped onto a cloth. Sometimes it was collected in a small bowl. In rare cases, it might even be saved as a sort of medicinal paste. There are written records of ancient people using this body oil mix for ailments. Some believed it helped with joint pain or skin conditions. And if you think that sounds unthinkable, well, welcome to ancient medicine. The oil itself was prized. Olive oil wasn't just for cooking, it was a luxury item. Expensive, aromatic, and sacred. It had religious significance, culinary importance, and household value. To use it in bathing was both indulgent and essential. You didn't pour it lavishly from a bottle. It was often stored in small containers called aribalu tiny ceramic, jars that could be worn on a cord or carried by an attendant, a few drops at a time, massaged in, spread across the arms and legs. It was sensual, social, and slightly slimy. But again, the goal wasn't disinfection. It was symbolic removal. You scrub it and scrape not to kill bacteria, which no one knew existed, but to remove what you could see and smell. And even that was sometimes optional. Some people preferred to keep a light sheen of oil on their skin. It looked healthy, radiant. A glistening body was admired, especially under torchlight or in the pale glow of a bathhouse window. Clean meant gleaming, not necessarily sanitary. What made the whole process even stranger was its communal nature. You didn't scrape in solitude, you stood among others. Maybe leaned against a pillar while someone worked over your back. Maybe sat while an attendant oiled your legs. Conversations flowed around you. Strigils clinked against basins. Bodies moved in and out of steam. There was no privacy, no curtain to draw. Just the collective act of scraping off the surface of your day. Alongside every other citizen doing the same dot and the strigils themselves, they were not always well maintained. A dull edge might tug painfully at body hair. A sharp one could cut you if used too eagerly. And there's no evidence that these tools were regularly cleaned with anything beyond a casual rinse. So whatever was left on the blade blood, plus bits of skin might linger. The line between ritual and revulsion was very thin, even in art. In literature, the scraping ritual is sometimes presented as elegant, almost serene. Statues of athletes show them holding strigils in poised hands, the bodies idealized, the muscles perfect. But real-life scraping was more awkward, more slippery, more human. Bodies aren't marble. They sweat, flinch, and wrinkle. The scraping didn't produce divine purity. It produced puddles. And despite all this, people returned daily. Because the experience, for all its filth and exposure, was satisfying. To feel the oil loosen your skin. To sense the tool dragging off the residue of long morning. To finish with a warm towel, maybe some perfumed powder. It gave the illusion of control, of polish, of beginning again. A new skin every day, even if the old one wasn't far behind dot in the end. The ritual of oil and scraping tells us more than we expect. It's a mirror of ancient values, communal over private, appearance over sterility, touch over distance. It reminds us that clean is a cultural idea. For them, it meant gleaming skin, fragrant oils, and shared tools, not sanitized surfaces or antibacterial soap. Their cleansing was not surgical, but symbolic. Not solitary, but social dot. So as you drift off, imagine that scraping sound, the gentle clink of metal, the slide across damp skin, the low conversation in the background. And the growing little pile of oily sludge at your feet, you're moved, in ribbons. It was disgusting, yes. But it was also daily life. You've soaked in a steamy room thick with body heat. You've rubbed yourself with oil, and maybe let an attendant scrape it back off with a curved bronze blade. You've dipped in a cloudy pool where olive oil floats on top like pond scum, and flecks of skin drift slowly like falling leaves. Now, you're done. Finished, wrinkled, warm, and slick. It's time to dry off. Except there are no towels. Not the fluffy, folded kind we think of now. No plush cotton. No wall-mounted racks. In the ancient bathhouse, once you stepped out of the water, the drying process was less about comfort and more about improvisation. Some bathers simply still and air-dried, letting the warm atmosphere of the tepidarium wick the moisture from their bodies. Others used scraps of cloth, often coarse linen or wool, to rub themselves down. If they had a servant, the servant might bring a cloth, but likely wasn't clean, nor particularly soft, and for many, there was nothing. You dripped. You shivered. You walked barefoot across cold floors with little trails of water or oil falling behind you. You weren't drying off. You were evaporating. This lack of towels wasn't just inconvenient. It was unhygienic, even by ancient standards. A reused drying cloth might be shared among several people, If it was damp from a previous bather, too, bad. You used it anyway. Laundry wasn't a daily task in most bathhouses. Cloth was expensive. Water, despite being funneled in through elaborate aqueducts, was still a resource that required labor to heat and manage. So the drying cloths, if provided at all, were used, reused, and rarely washed. Some bathers brought their own drying rags, and if you were rich, yours might even be dyed or perfumed. But the average citizen made do with whatever was available, or nothing. Imagine rubbing yourself with a piece of rough wool that had already seen 5 other bodies that day, damp, smelling faintly of old oil and mildew. The fibers catching on your skin as you tried to wipe away the very same grease you had just rubbed in. There was no real cleanliness here, just ritual. Just routine dot in some cases. The oil itself was left on. A sheen of moisture acting as a kind of protective layer. Shiny skin was fashionable, after all. And if you were going straight from the bathhouse into the evening air, you might wrap yourself in a toga or tunic before you were even fully dry. The fabric would have been the towel never had a chance to. The result? Clothes that became slick with body oil over time. Stained at the edges? Heavy in the heat? A bath might cleanse the outer layer of your body, but the moisture clung to you long after you left. And when you went home, it followed you, onto your bed, into your sandals, into every wooden bench you sat on that evening. Some wealthier bathhouses may have provided servants to dry you off more properly, gently patting you with cloths, sprinkling powdered perfume, even fanning you as you cooled down. But for most people, especially the working class, none of that was accessible. You dried like laundry on a line, slowly, unevenly, and never quite fully. And then, of course, there's the matter of the floor. Without towels to absorb anything, bathers left behind puddles, footprints, and oily streaks. These floors, made of stone or mosaic tile, became slippery dangerously so. Slipping in the bathhouse was a genuine risk, especially for the elderly. Or injured. In fact, some Roman graffiti makes fun of people who fell while walking out of a bath. Imagine sliding barefoot across a room smeared with oil and skin cells while trying to pretend nothing happened. And what of infections? Without a towel to dry off properly, your skin remained damp for long periods of time. Moisture that collected in body creases, underarms, growing, between toes created ideal environments for bacteria and fungi to flourish. Of course, no one knew that at the time. A mysterious rash might be chalked up to the bad air or an imbalance of humors. But in reality, many of these ailments likely spread because of shared cloth, dampness, and bare feet on communal floors. Some regions, bathers tried to mitigate this with powders dusting themselves lightly with ground chalk, scented earth, or even ashes to soak up leftover oil and moisture. These early drying agents worked about as well as you'd expect. They masked smell, clung to damp skin, and left behind chalky streaks. But they didn't stop the spread of infection or truly dry you. They just added a layer still. For the ancient bather, this was normal. The whole process from oiling to soaking to scraping to semi-drying wasn't about achieving perfect hygiene. It was about participation, belonging. You went to the bathhouse not just to clean yourself, but to be seen doing it. Even if you walked out with half-dried legs and a strange sticky sensation under your arms, you had performed your civic routine. And once outside, the air felt different. Your skin, still slightly oily, caught the breeze like polished marble. Your tunic, clinging damply, reminded you that you'd just come from somewhere important, somewhere cultural, somewhere where everyone else had also failed to dry off completely. You were part of the group now, clean enough, dry enough, socially acceptable, and still, in ways no one could see, carrying a bit of the bathhouse with you. So if you're lying in bed now, warm and dry, under a soft towel or blanket, think of those ancient bathers, dripping, gleaming, padding barefoot through echoing doors, with damp claws slung over their arms or nothing at all. Their skin cooled by open doorways, their clothes absorbing what the stone couldn't. It wasn't clean, not really. But it was civilization. One greasy step at a time. By now, you've soaked in the cloudy water, had your sweat scraped off with a communal blade, and half-heartedly dried your still oily skin with a damp cloth that may or may not have been used by 5 other strangers. It would be comforting to imagine that the worst of it is behind you. But then, somewhere in the corner of the building, or sometimes not even a separate room, you find them, the latrines. Because, yes, Roman bathhouses had toilets. And no, they were not private. And yes, they were just as gross as you think dot to modern sensibilities. The idea of combining a spa-like experience with public defecation sounds like the setup for a nightmare, but to the ancient Romans, it made a strange sort of sense. The bathhouse wasn't just a place for cleaning the body, it was a one-stop shop for hygiene, relaxation, and social life. That included relieving yourself. So the same building where you sat in a warm pool with neighbors was often the same place you'd drop your tunic and squat beside them on a long marble bench without walls. Without partitions and definitely without toilet paper, these communal latrines were usually located near the entrance or along a side corridor. They were long stone benches carved with evenly spaced holes. Sometimes they had smaller holes in the front for urine and larger holes in the seat for the rest. Beneath them ran a trough of constantly flowing water, designed to carry waste away, though the speed and cleanliness of that water was highly variable. The idea was clever. Waste would be swept into the sewer system by gravity and water flow. But in reality, the smell lingered, and the water didn't always do its job. Particularly in overused or under-maintained bathhouses, blockages, overflow, and general filth were common. There was no privacy. You sat shoulder to shoulder with other bathers, making conversation, sometimes even discussing politics or philosophy, while everyone did their business. In fact, part of being Roman, at least in the cities, was learning to do deeply private things in public. Defecation was just another communal ritual. You might nod at someone you just seen in the caldarium. He might pass you a cleaning. Sponge dot. Ah yes, the sponge on a stick. The trusorium. Rome's answer: toilet paper. After using the latrine, you dip the sponge into a shallow trough of water at your feet. Rinse it and use it to clean yourself. Then rinse it again and leave it behind for the next person. No, these weren't personal items. They were shared. If you were lucky, the water trough had some vinegar or salt added to it, an early form of attempted sterilization. But this was the exception, not the rule. The sponge was communal. And as with the strigil, it wasn't always in great shape. Just imagine it. The sponge, still damp from the last user, waiting in a pool of tepid gray water. You swirl it to maybe shake off a bit of detritus, then do what you need to do. There's no soap, no separate bin. No method to ensure that what's been wiped away stays away. And then, freshly wiped, you might rise, adjust your tunic, and head back toward the baths. Maybe even back into the water, because there was no requirement to wash again after using the latrine. In fact, you were probably still damp from earlier, so you returned to the bath just as you were, slightly more relieved, and no less contagious. And it's worth mentioning that some bathhouses didn't have separate latrine areas at all. Smaller, cheaper establishments sometimes offered only basic facilities, a hole in the floor, perhaps with a bucket beneath. Or worse, nothing at all. If nature called and the line for the toilet was too long, it wasn't unheard of for someone to relieve themselves in a dark corner or even in the bath itself. Some ancient writers make jokes about it. Others complain bitterly. But one thing's clear, the overlap between bathing and defecating was not accidental. It was designed into the space, even in more refined bathhouses, the proximity of toilets. To pools was troubling. Archaeologists have discovered drainage systems that allowed latrine runoff to seep into nearby baths. Not deliberately, of course, but through leaky pipes, blocked channels, or simple poor maintenance. So while you sat in the caldarium, letting the hot water soothe your joints, there was a non-zero chance that traces of waste were circulating somewhere nearby. The sponge you didn't use, the bench you sat on, the water you stepped into barefoot none, Of it was truly separate from the toilet space and the smell. Reports from ancient writers suggest it was often overwhelming. Some bathhouses tried to combat this with incense or perfumes, especially near the entrance. Others simply lived with it. You learn to accept that the faint scent of lavender in the air was doing battle with something far more ancient in the human body, in all its unfiltered glory. There's also the matter of accidents. Without partitions, without soap, and without plumbing that always worked, people sometimes left more than footprints behind. The floor near the latrines could be wet, slippery, and let's be honest, hazardous. Slipping on a marble floor in a bathhouse wasn't just a risk to your dignity. It was a health risk, a sanitary risk, a horrifying risk. And yet no one seemed especially alarmed. This was simply how things worked out. And then, with all that behind you, literally you'd return to the social core of the bathhouse, sit on a shared bench, rejoin the conversation, dip your feet back in the frigidarium. No one questioned the cycle. It was seamless. You entered the bathhouse. You sweated, soaked, scraped, relieved yourself, and moved on. And if your neighbor had done the same, if he'd skipped a rinse or wiped poorly, or used the same sponge as 10 other men that morning, well, that was just part of the deal. Because in the Roman world, hygiene wasn't about isolating the dirty from the clean. It was about embracing a ritual and experience. And if that experience involved sitting shoulder to shoulder in a toilet room with no walls, using a sponge that had seen too much, and then walking straight into a communal bath, that wasn't a problem. That was civilization. So now, as you lie in your bed, freshly showered, wrapped in clean sheets with running water in another room and private walls around your bathroom, remember, it wasn't always like this. For thousands of years, being clean meant stepping through a world of shared filth and sitting down next to someone while you both tried to pretend it wasn't happening. The water had cooled on your skin. You'd been scraped with a dull bronze blade, air-dried under flickering torchlight, and maybe even sat shoulder to shoulder in the latrines with strangers who smelled like vinegar and warm olive oil. You're ready to go home now, one step at a time. Barefoot, of course. Because in ancient public baths, everyone was barefoot. Sandals were left at the door. Shoes were frowned upon. You padded across the tiles like everyone else without thinking too much about what was beneath your feet. But you probably should have, because the floors were not just wet. They were alive. The bathhouse floor, especially in the larger thermi, was a constantly damp, low-lit environment with hundreds of people walking across it daily. That meant water, yes, but also oils, bits of dirt, skin flakes, hair, toe clippings, mucus, and worse. Add to that the occasional spill from the communal latrines or a poor attempt at vomiting discreetly in a corner, after overindulging in wine. The result was a moist, organic stew smeared thinly across the polished stone. Smooth mosaic tiles that once glistened in the morning light gradually became dull, pockmarked, and treacherously slick. And with every step, those ancient bathers carried a little bit of it with them, sticking to the soles of their feet at first glance. The floors might have seemed beautiful mosaic artwork beneath your toes, depicting dolphins, sea nymphs, or heroic myths. But between those colorful tiles, in the cracks and grooves, lurked colonies of mold and bacteria. The humidity, the heat, and the constant traffic created the perfect environment for fungi to thrive. Athlete's foot, ringworm, and all sorts of skin ailments found a comfortable home in the bathhouse floors. No one knew what fungi were, of course. A rash was just an unfortunate side effect of being alive. It might be blamed on bad humors, a draft of wind, or perhaps the gods were mildly annoyed with you, and yet there was no escape. Everyone's feet made contact with the same surface. There were no flip-flops, no protective mats, just bare flesh against slimy stone. If you slipped, as many did, you might catch yourself on the edge of a bench or a warm wall, but you might also go down hard. With the added hazard of bath oils coating the stone, every surface had the potential to bray you. And falling wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. A cracked hip, A bruised rib or even a concussion could happen in an instant, especially. For the elderly, some ancient writers actually mocked older men who dared to enter the baths, painting images of wrinkled, slippery bodies flailing in the steam. These weren't just jokes, they were warnings, but even those who didn't fall faced other quiet threats. A stubbed toe could lead to an infection. A scraped heel might never heal properly in such a damp environment. And then there were the invisible problems, the things you couldn't see, but that slowly took hold. A soft, itchy patch between your toes. A dry, flaking skin on the heel. A strange smell that wouldn't wash away, no matter how many times you scraped and oiled your feet. Fungal infections, untreated and misunderstood, could last for years. They weren't considered emergencies, just nuisances. And so many ancient people lived with foot conditions that would send a modern person sprinting to the nearest pharmacy. Some bathhouses tried to address the issue, at least visually. Attendants might sweep the floors occasionally, pushing the hair and gunk into the drainage channels. Water might be splashed across the tiles to give the illusion of cleanliness. But real sterilization? That was a dream centuries away. The floor simply absorbed what it was given and it gave it back over and over. And then there were the bathhouse pests. Insects were common. Gnats and flies thrived in the warm, damp corners. Sometimes lice would fall from a tunic and crawl across the floor. Rats, too, were no strangers to the underfloor heating systems. The hypocaust. Those warm, hollow spaces beneath the tiles were cozy, ideal rodent homes. If a rat died down there, the smell would slowly rise through the cracks, blending with the scent of oil, mildew, and half-washed humanity. Children were especially vulnerable. Their smaller feet picked up things more quickly. They slipped more easily, and they were less likely to notice a slow-growing infection. For some poorer families, the bathhouse was the closest thing to a doctor. A hot soak might be all the treatment a child received. But if that soak began and ended with a stroll across a damp, slimy floor, the result was often more harm than healing. And what about the feet of others? If you brushed past someone, touched ankles accidentally in the crowded pools, or stepped where another had just stood, congratulations. You were now part of the fungal network. It spread in silence, unseen, layer by layer, skin to skin. Floor to floor. The irony, of course, is that the bathhouse was meant to be the cleanest place in town, a temple to hygiene, a ritual of purification. And yet, the more you think about it, the more it seems like the perfect storm of communal grime. The floors, often the most ignored part, were the silent spreaders. You couldn't escape them. Every bather, no matter how rich or careful, left with a bit of it between their toes, and still people came. Daily, sometimes twice a day. They walked barefoot across warm stone mosaics, letting the grime of civilization rise up into the gaps of their skin. Because to be clean in ancient Rome or Greece didn't mean being sterile, it meant being part of a tradition. It meant sharing space, water, steam, and floors. You belong not because you avoided the filth, but because you accepted it as part of the deal. So as you lie in bed, warm and clean, feet tucked under soft blankets or curled against a cool sheet, think of those ancient bathers, walking slowly, carefully through slippery halls, their feet wet, their skin tingling with oil, and the quiet knowledge that whatever was on the floor today might be on them tomorrow. Imagine this. You've soaked in a pool clouded with oil and sweat, been scraped with a communal bronze blade, and wandered barefoot across a slippery fungal floor. You've sat in the latrines shoulder to shoulder with strangers, used the shared sponge, and made peace with the ever-present scent of warm mildew and something vaguely meaty. Now it's time to eat. Yes, eat. Because in the ancient world, the bathhouse wasn't just a place for bathing. It was a social center, a lounging space, and somehow a food court. After all the soaking, sweating, scraping, and slipping, nothing capped off the experience quite like reclining on a bench near the tepidarium and chewing on something roasted or sipping something sweet. And if that sounds bizarre, it's because it was. Bathhouses were often equipped with tabernae small food stalls, sometimes built directly into the bath complex itself. Picture vendors selling spiced wine, dried fruits, pastries, olives, and hunks of meat. You could buy hot mulled wine kalita served in a cup that may or may not have been rinsed between customers. You could chew on stuffed dates, salted nuts, or chunks of boiled eggs. Some even offered stew or porridge, ladled out from simmering pots beside a bot wall. These vendors were popular. Bathhouses were quick stops. People lingered for hours. And eventually the hunger set in, but there was no designated dining area. People ate wherever they found a spot on benches, in corridors, next to fountains, and yes, sometimes near the edge of the baths themselves. That meant food particles ended up everywhere. A bite dropped here, a spill there, olive pits rolling underfoot, crumbs wedged between tile cracks, greasy fingers smearing communal seats. Imagine lounging near the caldarium, still damp, and watching a man next to you bite into roasted pork and lick the juices off his hand and absent-mindedly pat his thighs and slide into the pool. There were no napkins, no forks. You ate with your hands. And those hands? They just come from the water or the latrines or both. Maybe they'd been scraped clean with oil, or maybe they hadn't. Soap, as we think of it today, wasn't part of the ritual. So the cleanliness of one's fingers before digging into a fig was more a matter of faith than fact. And the drinks? Mulled wine was often served warm, flavored with honey, pepper, or herbs. It was comforting, relaxing, and slightly intoxicating. Perfect for a bathhouse afternoon. But it also dulled your senses, making you less likely to notice when you sat in something sticky or leaned your head back against a wall, smeared with leftover oil. Drinking while semi-nude and overheated was also a fast track to lightheadedness, dizziness, slurred conversation. Ancient sources make note of bathhouse brawls, drunken mishaps, and people falling asleep mid-meal. Nothing says civilization quite. Like snoring on a stone bench with juice on your chin and someone else's foot resting on your cloak. The presence of food also attracted vermin. Mice and rats were already common in cities, but a bathhouse with scattered food was a paradise. Leftovers were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Bits of fruit fell between floor tiles. Bread crusts were dropped, and they ignored. And since many bathhouses were open late into the evening, the night belonged to the scavengers. Rodents roamed freely through the hypocausts, those warm underfloor heating chambers, and occasionally surfaced to nibble on something a guest had left behind. In some bathhouses, especially in poorer neighborhoods, it wasn't uncommon to hear the squeak of little feet echoing through the stone halls. Insects, too, were constant companions. The scent of sweet wine and warm meat mingled with human sweat and moisture, attracting gnats, flies, and wasps. There are reports of people swatting at bugs while lounging post-bath, wine in hand, still dripping. But again, no one seemed to mind. It was simply part of the experience. And then there's the issue of sharing. Romans were social eaters. It wasn't strange to offer a bite of your stuffed pastry to someone nearby or to accept a swig of wine from their cup. Sharing was a sign of connection, of community. But, of course, when everyone had just bathed together in a stew of skin cells and scraped their oil off with the same blade, sharing took on a new kind of intimacy. Unwitting bacterial communion, if you will. Let's not forget children. They, too, came to the baths. Little hands touching everything, climbing onto laps, begging for fruit, dropping half-eaten morsels onto damp floors and picking them up again, then dunking themselves back into the baths. It was all a blur of oil, noise, stickiness, and after the food was eaten, the wine drained and the wino crust scattered. You might return to the water. Full belly, sweaty brow, sticky fingers. You'd slip into a warm pool to rinse off alongside others doing the same, because that's how it worked. The bathhouse was circular. You could start your visit in the pool, eat in the middle, return for another scrape, then sit near the frigidarium to digest. There were no firm boundaries between stages of filth and cleanliness, just a steady churn of the human body and its appetites. It was disgusting. And it was normal. So as you lie comfortably in your bed, maybe with a clean snack nearby and a private bathroom down the hall. Consider what it might have felt like to reach for a honey-soaked fig in one hand while still glistening with sweat. Oil, and a day's collective bathwater. To sip warm wine next to a stranger, knowing you both used the same sponge and walked barefoot across the same slick floor. And to call it pleasure. Civilization. Luxury. Because to the ancients, it was. If you've been following along, you've already soaked in murky water, been scraped with a shared metal tool, eaten warm stew next to a guy still dripping from the frigidarium, and walked barefoot across a floor so damp it might qualify as a petri dish. But none of this would be possible without the quiet, overworked hands behind the whole operation, the bath attendants. The Roman bathhouse didn't run itself. Beneath the columns and mosaic floors, behind the steamy walls and stone benches, was a small army of people who made the entire experience function barely. They were called capsari, balneators, strigils bearers, and heating boys, and their job descriptions were equal parts janitor, masseur, servant, babysitter, and human. Sponge. Most of them were enslaved people or very low-paid workers, and all of them spent their days elbow deep in other people's grime.start with the capsarius, the locker room guy. He watched over the bathers' belongings while they soaked, scraped, and socialized. Sounds simple until you realize how many thefts took place. Theft was common. A distracted bather might return to find their tunic missing, their sandals swapped, or their money pouch gone. The capsarius got blamed, whether he was at fault or not. This meant the poor man had to be constantly alert, watching dozens of piles of sweaty clothes and hoping no one noticed that everything smelled the same. He often received little tips in exchange for good service or violent threats when things went wrong. Then there were the strigil assistants, the men responsible for oiling and scraping other people's bodies, all day, hour after hour. They'd rub warm olive oil across a bather's back, thighs, and arms, then take a metal strigil and scrape the mixture off, along with the sweat, dead skin, and whatever else clung to the flesh. Sometimes this was done tenderly, even sensually. Other times, it was rushed, brutal, and repetitive. Imagine scraping 20 strangers before noon, your hands sore, your tunic stained, your nostrils full of a smell that isn't entirely olive. Oil anymore. In hygiene, not a priority. The strigil might be wiped on a towel, dipped briefly in water, and moved on to the next body. The oil pots were reused. The cloths were reused. The strigils were reused, but the skin was new. Every time. New, yet somehow always the same damp, oily, tired. These attendants rarely had breaks. Bathhouses operated from dawn till evening. That meant long days on their feet, moving between the hot, humid caldarium and the chill of the frigidarium, often soaking wet themselves. If a bather slipped or needed help, the attendant rushed in. If someone vomited in a corner or had an unfortunate accident in the latrines, the bath attendant was the one who cleaned it up. No gloves, no protective gear, just cloth rags, sand for scrubbing, and a grim acceptance of the job. And then there were the heating attendants, often young boys who kept the fires burning beneath the hypocaust system. These boys worked in the suffocating tunnels under the floors, shoveling coal or wood into blazing furnaces to keep the pools warm and the steam rising. The air was choked with soot and smoke. The ceilings were low. It was back-breaking labor in blistering conditions. No one saw them. No one thanked them, but without them, the caldarium would be cold and the bathers would complain. The irony? These workers rarely got to enjoy the bathhouse themselves. They lived among the steam, the oil, the rituals, but they were not true participants. Their role was to facilitate other people's comfort, even when their own skin cracked from repeated exposure to oil and ash. They breathed in dampness and mildew. Their feet blistered on hot floors. Their clothes were never clean, and they were invisible. Artists carved bathers in marble. Poets praised the baths in verse. No one wrote poems about the man wiping down the strigil, or the boy scraping sludge from a drain, or the capsarius arguing with a drunk merchant about a missing cloak. These were background figures, unnamed, essential, forgotten. Some bath attendants did earn reputations, especially those who served the wealthy or became favorites among the regulars. A particularly skilled oiler might receive small gifts. A good-natured scraper might be invited to a bather's home. But this was rare. Most worked without praise. Their only reward being survival. It's worth imagining their daily rhythm. Morning. Clean up the leftover food from the night before. Sweep the mosaic floors. Stir the fire under the hypocaust. Then the first wave of bathers. Oil them. Scrape them. Fetch cloths. Re-oil. Clean. Scrape. Repeat. By midday, the floors are already slick. The drains are clogging. The air is thick. Someone is yelling about a stolen sandal. Someone else is passed out drunk next to the plunge pool. And through it, all the attendant keeps working. They didn't just clean bodies. They managed egos, soothed tempers, dealt with children, navigated flirtation, endured harassment, and fielded constant demands. More oil, harder pressure, watch my tunic, find my strigil, clean this puddle. Always moving, never resting. All for a few coins, if they were lucky. And then the day ended. The last bathers left, and the attendants stayed behind to mop, sweep, refill the oil, and lay out cloths for tomorrow. They trudged home through the dark streets, still smelling faintly of oil. Sweat and steam still damp, still unthanked. So as you lie in your bed tonight, skin dry, blanket soft, feet clean and untouched by the grime of the public floor. Think of the bathhouse attendants. The men and boys who scrubbed the filth, carried the towels, scraped the backs of strangers, and disappeared into the shadows. Civilization may have bathed itself in marble and steam, but it did so on the tired, oiled shoulders of the unseen. The steam swirls gently in the air. You're sitting on a smooth stone bench, your skin still glistening from oil and warm water, the sounds of gentle splashing and idle chatter drifting lazily through the corridors. It should be peaceful, serene, but you notice something, a lingering gaze from across the pool, a slight smile, a tilt of the head. It's not just steam thickening the atmosphere. It's something else. Because in ancient times, the public bathhouse wasn't only about hygiene. It was also about watching, flirting, and sometimes very awkward forms of romance. Let's begin with a very basic truth. People are people, and when you gather them together half naked in a warm room, things are going to get complicated. For many ancient Romans, the thermi weren't just a place to clean your body. They were a place to see and be seen. Think of them like today's coffee shops, gyms, or crowded beach boardwalk social, slightly performative and absolutely full of silent appraisals. Unlike our modern separation of gendered spaces, many Roman bathhouses had mixed bathing at certain times. Men and women could, and often did, share the same pools, especially in the afternoon. Some moralists hated this. Seneca complained about the immodesty. Pliny the Elder tutted disapprovingly, but the practice endured. And in that swirling warmth, with glistening bodies reclined along the walls, the bathhouse became a kind of steamy marketplace for flirtation. Imagine a man stepping into the cultarium, skin shining with fresh oil, casually scanning the room. As he lowers himself into the pool, or a woman adjusting her shoulder wrap just slightly, laughing too loudly at something a companion says. Eye contact lingered. Voices dropped to whispers. The sound of dripping water mixed with giggles and quiet compliments. Romance didn't wait outside the doors. It soaked right into the tiles. Some people came only for this. The philosopher Marshall even wrote mocking verses about those who visited the baths with too much perfume. Too many gold rings, or suspiciously. Clean nails signs that one wasn't there to wash, but to be admired. You're not bathing, he implies. You're fishing. And indeed, many bathers hoped to catch something, though not always love. For some, the bathhouse offered opportunities for casual liaisons. servants passed notes. Eye contact became hand-holding. Hidden corners behind steam pipes were occasionally used for private trysts, though privacy was hard to come by. You were just as likely to be interrupted by an oil attendant as by a curious elderly couple returning from the latrines. Romantic spontaneity often collided with extremely awkward timing. That's where the awkwardness comes in. Because bathhouses were not designed for flirting, there were no cozy booths, no candlelight, just wet, echoing chambers full of half-dressed people trying not to slip. Add to that the presence of children, elderly citizens, and people loudly debating grain prices. In the corner, and you can imagine how quickly the mood could turn dot, and then there's the noise. The constant background soundtrack of splashing, coughing, scraping, and clanging. The oil strigil being wiped down. The rattle of sandals being collected from the caps race. The occasional drunk yelling about someone stealing his towel. It was not subtle. If you were trying to whisper sweet nothings, you'd have to do so over a very loud, very damp chorus of everyday. Still, some managed to find connection. We even have love spells written on ancient tablets and scratched into bathhouse walls. Little inscriptions that say things like, "May Tolia fall in love with me at the third hour," or "Let Lucius notice me when I pass by a hot pool." These magical graffiti were tiny stabs at romance, cast into the bathhouse steam like wishes into a wishing well. And they reveal something intimate beneath all the noise and the filth. Someone was hoping to be seen got sometimes romance wasn't. Mutual. Bathhouses were also places of unwanted attention. With everyone exposed, the line between flirting and pestering was often blurred. Some ancient sources mention groping, teasing, or inappropriate jokes. The bathhouse was public, yes, but it was also vulnerable. There were no bouncers, no rules against eyeing someone for a little too long. And for women, especially, this made the bath a risky place. Some chose to bathe in groups for protection. Others avoided mixed hours entirely. Then there were the romantic misunderstandings. Maybe a glance was misread. Maybe a smile wasn't meant for you. Maybe you thought that elbow touch during this scraping session meant something only to realize they were just trying to keep their balance. It could be mortifying. And unlike a private dinner party, you couldn't just disappear quietly. You had to finish your bath. Maybe even stand next to the person in the frigidarium. Say nothing. Pretend you weren't blushing. Some bathhouses hired musicians to play during busy hours, flute players or singers. Their melodies floated through the steam, giving everything a slightly romantic haze. For some, it was enough. A soundtrack to a daydream. For others, it was a signal. Now is the time to make your move. Offer a fig. Compliment someone's sandals. Share a towel, though, to be honest, it was probably damp and slightly stained. Did bathhouse romances ever last? Probably not often. These encounters were usually fleeting brief flames of interest that disappeared with the next splash of cold water. But sometimes sparks caught. We have tomb inscriptions that mention couples who met at the baths. She smiled at me near. The steam chamber, one epitaph reads, and I never looked away again. But more often, bathhouse love was like the water itself, warm, foggy, and full of things you'd rather not think about too closely. It was sweet, then awkward, exciting, then itchy. Shared glances, shared sponges, and 1,000 ways to misstep. On wet stone dot, so tonight as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, imagine that moment, two strangers sitting across from each other in a pool full of steam, noise, and floating bits of oil. Somewhere between a flirtation and a foot cramp, a romance tries to take shape. It's damp. It's ridiculous. And somehow it's still a little bit human, somewhere in the background. Behind the scraping of strigils, the muttered conversations, the hiss of hot water being poured into cold, and the clinking of amphorae being refilled with olive oil is another sound. Higher pitched, louder, less elegant. The unmistakable echo of a child's shriek bouncing off a stone wall. Because, yes, the ancient public bathhouse wasn't just a sanctuary for weary adults or philosophical elders. It was also full of children. Sticky, shrieking, energetic children, and they brought with them not just chaos, but also a very specific kind of filth dot. You might imagine a relaxing soak in the caldarium. Steam curling lazily around your face when suddenly a small body cannonballs into the water beside you, sending a wave of warm skin flake infused water directly into your nose. A second later, another child slips on the wet floor and knocks over a low jar of oil. Then someone's sandal is thrown. Someone else is crying. A woman yells across the tepidarium. And somewhere in the background, a young boy giggles as he runs completely naked across the entire bath complex, trailing water and crumbs from the honey cake. He wasn't supposed to bring into the pool. Children were everywhere in the bathhouse. Wealthy families brought their sons and daughters as part of daily life. And poorer families who had no private bathing space at home came to the baths together, parents, grandparents, toddlers. There were no family hours. No child-free zones. The bathhouse was a free-for-all open to every age group, and often packed to the mosaics with squirming, slippery little people. They didn't follow the rituals, of course, where adults moved through the warm, hot, and cold rooms in a careful sequence, sweating, scraping, rinsing. Children ran. They splashed water, played chasing games, dunked their heads into fountains, and flailed across the pools like sea creatures who had never seen a rulebook. A space designed for quiet relaxation quickly became a slippery arena of chaos. Some bath attendants tried to stop them, gently scolding, waving cloths, or trying to corral them toward their parents. But it rarely worked. Children had too much energy and too few consequences. And because bathing was a communal public necessity, no one was going to leave early just because a child was screaming. You adapted. You rolled your eyes. You rinsed. Someone else's child's crumbs off your thigh and kept soaking. The noise level alone was enough to fray the nerves. Laughter, tantrums, the sound of arguments between siblings, the wet slap of feet on stone as a toddler tried to escape their mother's grip. At least one historian, Seneca, predictably grumpy, wrote with horror about the shrieking of children in bathhouses. For those who hope to meditate or compose poetry in this soothing heat, the shrill interruptions of a child dunking his brother in the frigidarium could ruin the whole afternoon. Then there's the cleanliness factor. Children are not known for personal hygiene. They might have been dragged to the baths against their will, squirming and whining. And once there, they did not exactly participate in the standard oil scrape rinse routine. Many skipped steps, or just rolled around on a warm bench and called it done. Some refused to be scraped with a strigil. Others snatched the sponge on a stick and used it to sword fight. And since the concept of don't pee in the water had yet to be successfully introduced in the ancient curriculum, accidents, let's just say, happened. No one tested water quality in ancient Rome. But if they had, they might have found that pools frequented by children had significantly higher levels of contamination. All the elements were there: urine, runny noses, skin conditions, the odd. Mouthful of spilled food, and endless small hands touching every bench, every wall, every oil jar. Children made contact with everything and shared it generously. A cold, a rash, a touch of intestinal distress. The bathhouse was the perfect place to distribute it to your entire neighborhood, and yet children weren't only tolerated, they were expected. Bathhouses weren't temples of silence or sterilized oases. They were community spaces, a place for all of life to swirl together in one damp, noisy, slippery stew. The presence of children made that clear. This was not a spa. It was a public gathering, and the next generation had every right to splash, scream, and drip honey into the frigidarium. Of course, some families tried to rein in the chaos. Parents brought cloths to mop up spills, warned children not to run, a warning ignored within seconds, and tried to keep their offspring within arm's reach. But even the most disciplined Roman child was still a child, curious, sweaty, distracted, easily bored. And a bathhouse was the perfect place to misbehave. So many corridors, so many echoing rooms, so many grown-ups trying not to pay attention. The bathhouse wasn't always safe either. Children slipped. They scalded themselves near the hot walls. They'd poked at embers that fell from heating tunnels. They fell into deeper pools and had to be yanked out, coughing and wailing. And still, the next day, they came back just as loud, just as messy, just as determined to cannonball into someone else's quiet soak knot in a way. It was charming. The bathhouse was one of the few places where rich and poor, young and old, shared. The same space, the same oil, the same germs. It was democracy moist and screaming. And for many children, it was the best part of the day. A warm pool. A cool, echoing hallway to run through. Other kids to shout with. Strange snacks to steal. And 100 strangers to annoy. And so, as you settle into your clean, silent room, no echoes, no splashes, no small, sticky hand tapping your leg. Remember that in the ancient world, even the most sacred rituals of cleansing came with noise. Crumbs and the distant cry of a child dropping a fig into a public pool. Above the surface, the Roman bathhouse was all polished marble and swirling steam. Laughter echoed. Bodies soaked and scraped. Oil glistened across skin and trickled lazily into shallow pools. But below that surface, hidden beneath the mosaic floors and hollow walls, something much darker crept. The quiet, heavy, gurgling world of water, waste, and ancient plumbing. Because everything that was rinsed off oil, sweat, bits of skin, bathwater, wine, urine had to go somewhere. And where it went was complicated. Let's start with the hypocaust, the famous Roman underfloor heating system. It's often celebrated for its cleverness. Stone floors raised on brick pillars, with hot air circulating beneath them to warm the rooms above. But those same cavities were also prone to collecting things. Dust, soot, rat nests, forgotten sandals. Sometimes even broken tiles or fallen scraps of food. Bath attendants had to crawl in occasionally if they were unlucky and clean it out. The same system that kept your bath delightfully warm was also, quite literally, crawling with old debris and pest activity dot. Then there were the drains, the lifelines of the bathhouse. Water was constantly being added to the system, either by pipe or bucket, and it had to exit just as constantly. Drainage channels were carved into the floors and beneath the walls, often leading into nearby cloaca, the Roman sewer system. And to be fair, it was a fairly advanced system for its time. But advanced doesn't mean clean. In fact, it was more like a slow-moving digestive tract for the entire city. Picture it. Cloudy bathwater full of skin flakes, oil, perfume, soap substitute, often ashes or sand, food crumbs, and whatever floated off people's bodies being funneled downward. Sometimes it flowed freely. Other times it stalled. A clump of hair could block a narrow section. A particularly oily stream could coat a pipe's inner surface and thicken like cooking grease. And when the slope wasn't steep enough, the sludge just sat, warm, dark, and undisturbed. Until it wasn't in some bathhouses, maintenance was infrequent at best. Pipes were made from clay, lead, or terracotta, easily cracked or shifted with time. Earthquakes, heavy use, or even rats tunneling nearby could dislodge a segment. Water stopped flowing. Waste began pooling. And then, a few days later, a floor drain might burp upward with a wet cow belch that sent everyone skittering away. Not exactly the serene spa atmosphere most visitors were expecting. Even when things did work, the drainage systems didn't always separate clean from unclean. Some baths drained directly into sewers that were also used by nearby latrines, meaning a backflow could introduce human waste into what had just been a tepid soaking pool. There were no anti-siphon valves, no backup alarms, just gravity and hope. And hope in the ancient world was a leaky sort of guarantee. Then there's the problem of sludge. Over time, the combination of oil, dirt, skin, and other debris created a slow-building muck inside the pipes and drains. Modern archaeologists sometimes find these layers in cross-sections, like the rings of a very unfortunate tree. This sludge could cling to walls, congeal in corners, or even fossilize into thick, patches of black tar-like buildup. And yet the bathhouse continued to operate, hour after hour, day after day, pouring more water through those same channels. And if you're wondering, yes, the smell made its way back up. Even in the nicest facilities, there was often a faint odor, sour, damp scent that clung to the drains and hovered near floor grates. On especially warm days, when the steam pushed air upward from the sewers, you could be soaking in the caldarium while invisible vapors from the ancient underworld crept quietly around your ankles. Some bathhouses tried to mask it with incense or strong perfumes. Others ignored it. One Roman poet jokes that if you sat near a certain corner of the frigidarium too long, your clothes would smell like a ditch for 3 days. When clogs got serious, someone had to fix them. That someone was usually a slave or low-class laborer, armed with a long stick, a pail, and very few choices in life. He'd crawl into a tunnel up to his knees in warm mystery goo and poke at the blockage until the pressure broke. Sometimes the system flushed forward, spraying the contents through the drains in a noxious rush. Other times, it simply trickled and left him to scoop. Imagine finishing a long day in the bath only to walk barefoot across a floor that had recently been washed with overflow water from the blocked toilet channel. Because that happened in wealthier cities, public bathhouses might be connected to cisterns or aqueducts, allowing a continuous supply of fresh water. But even that luxury came with problems. Birds died in open tanks. Leaves clogged sluices. Minerals built up in the aqueduct mouth. Water wasn't filtered. It was redirected, which meant that what reached your bath might have passed over dead lizards somewhere upstream, or through 3 miles of sun-baked stone lined with mold and moss dot. And then there's the simple truth of human error. A valve left open too long. A heating pipe cracked by overuse. A drainage route diverted by careless renovations. Baths were busy places, and maintenance was often patchwork. A blocked pipe could affect not just one pool, but an entire section of the complex. Warm water turned tepid. Cold water overflowed. The air filled with the scent of mildew and regret. Still, people came. Daily. They stepped across those drains, watched the water disappear, pretended not to see the slime clinging to the edges, because the baths weren't about perfection. They were about habit, community, ritual. You accepted the smell. The noise. The occasional gurgling grate that hinted at something deeply unpleasant a few feet below your heel. And as you close your eyes tonight, warm and dry, with clean water at the turn of a tap and drains that mostly behave themselves, remember that. In the ancient world, the illusion of cleanliness was carefully balanced on a network of pipes and a whole lot of sludge. In theory, the ancient Roman bathhouse was a place of order. A kind of steamy stage where the rituals of daily hygiene were carried out with grace and structure. People moved from room to room in sequence. They bathed in turn. They scraped in silence. They respected the space. That was the theory. In practice, the Roman bathhouse was full of unwritten expectations. Social tension, strange rules, and 1,000 little acts of defiance. Bathhouse etiquette existed, but it was more of a suggestion. And almost everyone broke it. Let's start with the basics. When you entered the appetitorium, the changing room, there were certain things you were supposed to do. You greeted the capsuleus politely. You undressed and stored your clothes without fuss. You didn't try to bring your entire household's belongings into a shared locker space, but people did. Some brought pets. Some brought food. Some even tried to smuggle in musical instruments, hoping to show off their talents in the echo-filled chambers. One poet complained about a man who brought a harp to the baths and sang loudly during the oiling process. No one could stop him. No one dared try. Then there were rules about nudity. In many baths, full nudity was expected. That was part of the point. No class, no status, no pretense, just bodies. But not everyone followed this with the same enthusiasm. Some wrapped themselves in carefully draped cloths and refused to uncover. Others did the opposite, striding boldly from pool to pool, as if they owned the entire complex. Children ran naked without a care. Elderly men with sagging bellies ignored any suggestion of modesty. It was supposed to be normal, but in reality, it made a lot of people uncomfortable and led to endless complaints, quiet gossip, and awkward glances. Speaking of awkwardness, there were rules about noise. Technically, the bathhouse was supposed to be a place of relaxation. People spoke in calm tones. They exchanged philosophy, poetry, or polite conversation. But once again, theory collapsed. The actual bathhouse was often loud. Vendors shouted. Attendants barked orders. Friends laughed raucously. Children screamed. And in the middle of it all, someone might be singing or reciting their terrible poetry to anyone who would listen or couldn't escape. One particularly annoying habit? Splashing. It wasn't allowed, at least not by adults. The idea was to enter the pools with grace, without disturbing others. But many didn't care. Young men jumped in with bravado. Children turned the frigidarium into a game. And even some older bathers, perhaps fueled by wine or the thrill of being slippery, and semi-nude, got carried away. Splashes hit faces. Oil drifted into someone else's towel. Arguments followed, but the rules still technically in place. Then there were personal grooming habits. You were supposed to scrape yourself clean before entering the pools. That was the entire point of the strigil process. But some bathers got lazy, or distracted, or simply ignored the system altogether. They stepped into the caldarium still covered in oil, bits of food on their chin, and a faintly sour smell clinging to their armpits. Others insisted on shaving right there in the bathhouse, leaving tiny clippings of hair in the water, or scattered across a bench like pepper flakes. And some, of course, used the shared tools with absolutely no intention of cleaning them. Afterward, there were also unspoken rules about space. Don't sit too close. Don't hover. Don't linger in someone else's corner. But the bathhouse was always crowded, and boundaries were porous. You might find yourself elbow to elbow with a complete stranger, trying to avoid eye contact while your knees accidentally brushed beneath the water. And if you moved, someone else immediately filled the gap. What about flirting? Technically frowned upon, but frequently practiced. People made eye contact across the steam. They whispered sweet nothings over shared oil jars. Some slipped notes or tried to arrange meetings in the changing room afterward. It was a public setting, but that didn't stop private ambitions. And if you weren't interested, too bad. You still had to sit through it, or awkwardly pretend. You didn't hear someone compliment your toes while you were just trying to rinse your elbow. One of the most frequently broken pieces of etiquette, cleanliness itself. You were supposed to be clean before you got in, or at least clean for others' sake. But people skipped steps. They scraped too quickly, or not at all. They wiped themselves with a cloth that had already been used 5 times that morning. Some even relieved themselves in corners quietly, discreetly, but unmistakably. The latrines were only a few steps away, but laziness, or wine, often won. Outdot, and then, of course, there was theft. You were supposed to trust the capsuleus, but many bathers didn't. They hid valuables inside their sandals, tied coin purses under folds of cloth. Some even took turns guarding the pile while friends bathed. And still things disappeared. Rings, tunics, favorite strigils. The etiquette was to be honorable, but temptation soaked into the walls along. With the steam, finally there was a rule so old it was practically a myth. Don't bring lawsuits into the bathhouse. The idea was that the baths were a neutral ground, a place where enemies could soak in peace. But in real life, it didn't hold. Arguments flared, voices rose. Friends turned enemies over a spilled oil jug or a misplaced sandal. Public insults were flung, and more than once, a brawl broke out in the middle of the caldarium, with slippery men tumbling over each other in a tangle of limbs and profanity. It wasn't elegant, but it was very Roman dot, so as you lie in your quiet room, wrapped in clean sheets, far from the sound of splashes and poorly recited Latin poetry, think about all those ancient bathers. The ones who forgot their manners, broke the rules, and made the bathhouse what it really was, not a temple of order, but a glorious, noisy, sweaty mess of humanity. A place where etiquette came to relax, and usually slipped on the floor. The sun is low now. The last rays of golden light spill through high, cracked windows. The laughter is faded. The footsteps have ceased. One by one, the voices have died out until finally, the bathhouse is still. You might think that after a full day of bathing, scraping, shouting, flirting, and splashing, the building would feel clean, empty, peaceful, but it doesn't. Not really. Because after the last sandals have shuffled out and the final robe has been draped across the shoulder, the bathhouse reveals its true state, not one of calm or serenity, but of slow decay, oily residue, and half-lit silence. Closing time was when the bathhouse breathed in the consequences of the day dot begin the apodaterium, the changing room. All day it echoed with chatter, the rustle of robes, and the snapping of coin purses. Now it's quiet but not empty. The floor is littered with forgotten sandals, crumbs, and the occasional wine-stained cloth. The benches are sticky. Somewhere under one of them, a small puddle of oil has begun to congeal. No one claims it. It's not clear how it got there. The capsarius, the changing room attendant, counts the days lost and found a child's sandal. A broken strigil, 2 copper coins, a fig, move into the tepidarium, and the air is still warm, but growing heavy. The steam is thin, yet everything feels damp. The walls sweat gently. The stone benches, once packed shoulder to shoulder, are now streaked with body prints and trails of oil. It's here that smells linger the longest. Scented oils, mildew, and wet wool hang like a low fog. A single towel lies on the ground, too soaked to be useful, too gross to touch. No one has picked it up. The water, too, hasn't fully drained. In some places, puddles remain murky and quiet. A stray fig seed floats near the edge of a pool. A fragment of cloth clings to a corner of tile. There's a coin pressed into a patch of black grime that no one noticed or cared enough to retrieve. A child's fingerprints are still visible on the fogged glass near the entrance. The caldarium, once alive with movement, is now still and stifling. The heat lingers long after the fire has been dampened. The pools here are the most polluted. Slippery sheen glistens on the surface of the water oil, skin flakes, and sweat suspended together in a quiet, swirling blend. The walls echo faintly, but no one is there. It feels like something is holding its breath. Then there's the frigidarium, once loud with shocked yelps and splashing limbs. Now it's just cold. The water is still. A faint draft moves across the surface, stirring a single hair floating beside. A half-eaten date. A smudge on the edge of the pool, likely a muddy footprint marks where someone stood too long before slipping in. The cold here bites differently after dark. It's no longer refreshing. Just hollow dot in every room. The floors are a mess. Oily puddles. Stray leaves. Grit tracked in by dozens of bare feet. It collects in the corners, crumbs from honey cakes, shards of broken pottery, gnawed olive pits, and dark smears from sources best not inspected too closely. A trail of something sticky runs from the edge of one pool to the wall where an attendant sits quietly, waiting for the building to finally be empty. Waiting to begin the cleanup, because after hours, the bathhouse had another life. A different rhythm. The attendants stayed behind. They didn't rest. They swept. They scrubbed. They emptied what they could and ignored what they couldn't. The heating boy's skin, slick with soot, emerged from the furnace tunnels, like specters, dragging buckets of ash and soot through the halls. No one applauded them. No one paid them extra. They just kept working. Buckets sloshed across mosaic floors. Cloths soaked in vinegar and water were used to wipe benches, sometimes to little effect. Drains were poked with sticks. Strigils were dunked into cloudy water and swirled around half-heartedly. The smell didn't go away, it merely changed. From perfume and sweat to wet stone and damp firewood, insects emerged. Gnats hovered. Rats scuttled along the edges. The baths were never sealed. Gaps in the stonework, crumbling corners of wall, these were thoroughfares for the night's less welcome guests. They waited patiently during the day. Now they roamed freely, and so did others, because the baths weren't always truly empty. After hours, some returned, lovers looking for privacy, thieves hoping for forgotten valuables, even beggars seeking warmth by a still hot wall. The night belonged to those who didn't mind shadows, who weren't troubled by the smell, who didn't care if they were alone. The echoes changed, too. What was once filled with laughter and conversation now carried the sound of dripping water. Shifting stone, the occasional sigh of a tired worker wringing out a rag. In some places, the wind hummed softly through small cracks in the ceilings. In others, there was silence so thick it seemed to muffle your own breath. Outside, the city dimmed. Torches flickered in alleyways. The crowds vanished. But inside the bathhouse, the memory of the day still hung in the air like a cloud, the trace of hundreds of bodies. Their heat, their filth, their voices. The space held on to them like the imprint on a cushion after someone stands. It wasn't gone, just waiting. Tomorrow it would begin again. More sandals, more yelling. The bathhouse never really cleaned itself. It simply reset. Covered yesterday's grime with fresh water. Swirled today's sweat into yesterday's sludge. Made room for new footsteps on the same stained floors. And no one cared. No one expected better so tonight, as you lie in your clean sheets with a silent room and not a single echo of someone scraping oil from their back nearby. Think of that ancient bathhouse. Think of the moment the last voice faded, the last sandal slapped the floor, and the building stood alone, not empty, not clean, just paused, waiting to be filthy again. They didn't close all at once. There was no sudden shuttering of doors, no proclamation that the water must stop flowing, that the strigils be hung up for good, that the steam should drift away into the forgotten sky. Instead, like so many things in history, the baths died slowly, drip by drip, crack by crack, room by room. And in the end, they were not buried, not hidden, but left behind stone skeletons of what once was the pulsing, soaking, filthy heart of Roman daily life. At their peak. There were hundreds of public bathhouses in the Roman world, some small and local, serving just a handful of neighbors. Others, grand and sprawling, built by emperors to dazzle crowds, lined with marble and mosaics, stretching across entire city blocks. The baths of Caracalla, for example, could hold over 1,600 people at once. These were temples of heat and water, engineered to impress, to serve, and to survive. And for centuries they did. But slowly, something shifted. The aqueducts, those remarkable bridges of water from faraway springs, began to break down. Some were destroyed by invading armies. Others simply fell into disrepair. No fresh water meant no baths. And when the supply grew irregular, people stopped coming. A bathhouse without reliable water is just a cold, echoing ruin with soggy benches. And nowhere to soak up the fuel, too, became a problem. Feeding the hypocaust systems, the underground furnaces that kept floors warm and steam. Rising required an enormous amount of wood. As the empire's trade networks frayed and forests were depleted, the cost of heating became unsustainable. Rich citizens built private baths. Poorer ones went without. The public bathhouses, once bustling with every social class, began to feel cavernous. The voices were fewer, the steam thinner. The laughter echoed too long before fading. Then came the disease. Plague swept through the empire, some devastating, others recurring. And with them came fear. The bathhouse, once a symbol of health, became a suspected breeding ground. People whispered that the pools held death, that the steam carried illness, that oil jars could spread something worse than a rash. Some cities shut their baths temporarily. Others never reopened them. But perhaps the biggest change was one of belief. As the Roman world shifted from a pagan empire to a Christian one, the bathhouse came under moral scrutiny. The open nudity, the mixed bathing, the flirtation, the vanity, the indulgence, it all clashed with the new doctrines of modesty. sin. Bishops condemned them. Writers mocked them. What had once been a communal, sacred routine now seemed decadent. Dirty in more ways than one. Some baths were repurposed. Their stones used to build churches. Their columns reused in cathedrals. Mosaics were torn up. Statues defaced. The baths didn't explode or vanish. They dissolved, piece by piece, into the rising medieval world. Grass crept through cracks in the floor. Birds nested in the rafters. Rain fell through what had once been marble ceilings, trickling down the same walls that had once sweated with human heat. Others stood longer, empty but still whole. The baths of Diocletian in Rome, for instance, were converted into a church, then a museum, and still hold echoes of their former life. Walk through them today, and you can almost hear it, the quiet plash of water, the thud of a sandal, the faint scrape of a strigil in the next room dot, and then there are the forgotten ones dot in small towns. Far from the heart of the empire, bathhouses were left to rot. Roofs collapsed, pools filled with mud, frogs moved in. Vines wrapped themselves around crumbling pillars. Centuries passed. Locals forgot what the buildings had once been. Farmers plowed fields over sunken chambers. Goats grazed where emperors. Once soaked archaeologists, when they uncover these sites today, often find strange traces of life stopped mid-soak. A coin in a drain, a sandal lodged beneath a bench, oil-stained stone that still smells faintly of age, and sometimes graffiti scratched. Messages from bathers long gone. I was here. Lucia is beautiful. Beware the thief. These ghosts of daily life cling to the ruins, refusing to vanish dot, and yet, even in their ruin, the baths remain strangely alive. People return not to bathe, but to explore. Children climb the broken walls. Monks use them for shelter. Later, artists wandered through them, sketching fallen columns in notebooks. Writers visited and wrote about the past. The ruins became symbols of what had been lost and what might rise again, because, in a way, the bathhouse never really died. Its spirit, its purpose, the daily gathering of people, the ritual of cleaning, the gossip, the warmth, the noise, it all lived on in different forms. In Turkish hammams, in Japanese onsens, in modern spas, in swimming pools and locker rooms, and even crowded public showers after a long day at the beach. The echoes of ancient baths are still with us, just less oily so tonight as you drift off, picture the final day of an ancient bathhouse. A thin stream of water drips from a cracked pipe. The last towel hangs limp and forgotten on a hook. Dust swirls in a shaft of sunlight. Somewhere in the shadows, a mosaic of Neptune watches over nothing. No feet splash across his waves. No voices interrupt his silence, just stone and memory. And beneath it all, deep in the cracks of the drains and the corners of the pools still, they're still clinging a thin, dark, oily film. The final trace of everything that passed through. The final whisper of a civilization that soaked, scraped, steamed, and then slipped quietly away.